Welcome to another week of social problems. This week we examine whether there is social inequality based upon age, specifically on the elderly in the United States. And so first we have to answer the question of who is elderly or who is old in the United States. And while you might think this is a biology question, how much has our body aged biologically, it's actually a social category. If you think about your own definition of who is old, you're probably like me in thinking that old people are about 10 to 15 years older than me. So when I was 15, 30-year-olds were old. When I was 5, 15-year-olds were old. Now that I'm 40, 50-year-olds are old. So it's usually about 10 to 15 years older than you. You could think about society dividing up its population into 3 age groups. There's the young, who are primarily focused on kind of getting ready, preparing for being an adult. Adults who are starting businesses, working jobs, raising children, preparing for retirement, helping out their community. And then there's the older group, or the old people, who are sort of relaxing, resting, mentoring a little bit, reflecting on their working experience. Now, life expectancy plays a large role in determining who is old. If you think about what would happen if by 40 years of age most people had died, then by the time you were 35, you would be old.
Yeah, but when would that ever happen?
Yes, during the Middle Ages, life expectancy in Europe was about 30 years old. In the United States, life expectancy at birth, that means the expected number of years that people are going to live from the day that they're born, is about 75 to 80 years old, depending on one's gender. And so we consider somebody elderly when they're about 65. 65 kind of marks that traditional retirement age in which we expect people to begin thinking beyond work, beyond productivity in the marketplace, and more upon other things. Working is actually good for us. It's good for our mental health. It's good for our relationships. And so we want to stay productive. We want to stay engaged in life, engaged in society. That's going to keep us strong and keep us healthy for much longer than, say, retiring, playing dominoes, drinking margaritas on the beach, watching soap operas. That's actually a kind of a recipe for frailty, disease, and disaster. Okay, well, in the United States, we have an increasing number of elderly people. This is really what makes this topic very relevant today. Never in the history of the United States have we had as many elderly people as we have right now, and we are expected to have even more elderly people in the next couple of decades. Let me give you some numbers just to try to drive this point home. In 1820, the median age, which is the age at which half the population is younger and half the population is older, was 17. So once you turned 17 in 1820, now you were at that middle age range where half the people were younger than you and half the people were older than you. In 2000, which as of this recording was about 20 years ago, that number more than doubled to 35. In 2030, according to our best crystal balls, that number will increase to 42. if you think about it, in 1820, 17 was the median age. Half the people were older, half the people were younger. To 2030, that 42 years old will now be that new number where half the people will be older than 42 and half the people will be younger than 42. A really dramatic shift. This phenomenon is sometimes called the graying of America because more and more people are getting old. But it's not just the United States where this is occurring. This is occurring in pretty much every rich country around the world. So this is most of Europe. This is China. This is Japan. This is Australia. This is Canada. And it's really not even restricted to just the rich world. There are just many, many countries in the world where the number of elderly people is growing so much compared to the other groups of people. One of the things that impacts this a lot is the fact that we're not having as many children. And so if you don't have as many children, then the people who are elderly, they're kind of outweighing the number of youth because they're just not being born at the same rate as they used to be. So why has this change occurred? Well, for one, we're living longer, which is like, duh, we're living longer. But this is because a couple of reasons. Our medicine has gotten much more effective, but also the fact that public health has increased. We're putting fluoride in the water. We're trying to push vaccines so that people don't get the diseases that would prematurely shorten their lives. But also the fact that lifestyle for many people has gotten better. We now understand that things like smoking and potato chips and even staying up late is not good for our health. And people take responsible choices. We have lots of gyms open today where people can go exercise. People are eating a lot more fresh fruits and vegetables than they did back in the 70s and 80s when canned food was much more popular and was kind of considered the new sort of trendy way of eating. We now understand a lot more about our own health, and it's not just the medical professionals who are making good choices for us. Many Americans are deciding that they want to live healthier, and they're taking steps like buying a Peloton, like joining a walking group, like not smoking, like not drinking. Other things like seatbelt wearing is become the expectation, and if you don't wear a seatbelt, it's become deviant.
Hey, isn't this good?
Is it a good thing that we're living longer? Well, if you're a healthy 80-year-old who's feeling good, then yes, it is very much a good thing. And I think that overall, it's a good thing. When we're young, we don't necessarily appreciate living longer, but like you would if you were 80 years old. Now, there are some 80-year-olds who are frail and unhealthy and unhappy, and for them, living longer may not be a positive thing for them. And so it kind of depends, but I think overall it's a positive trend. Again, especially if you have somebody who is elderly, who you really care about, or if you yourself are doing well in life and you want to keep living, then yes, this is a positive thing. I mentioned that there are less youth today than there were in the past. The number of children that Americans and people worldwide have been having has been decreasing for over 100 years now. In the 1950s, 50s and like 60s, there was a generation that was born who kind of broke the mold, and those were the baby boomers. So after World War II, the war was over, people were feeling good, the economy was really strong after the war in the United States, and people had a lot of children. But that was sort of an abnormal thing. The trend had been going down since the 1900s, And then in the 1950s, it goes up a little bit. People have a lot of children during this baby boom era, and then it kind of has continued on this kind of downward slope. So people are having less children than they did in the past. And this is because there's a lot more education required in order to live a middle class lifestyle. And so people are delaying marriage, they're delaying childbearing until their education is finished. And so people are waiting to get married and have children until their mid 20s, sometimes even early 30s. And that reduces the number of children born. There is much more importance placed on people's careers today than there was in the past. And this is especially true for women, where, if you imagine an average woman and she is a lawyer and considers her career very important, that is going to put downward pressure on the number of children that she's going to have, because every child that she has takes her out of the working world, and oftentimes women pay a price for having a child. And then the other thing is that we have better and more effective, more widely used birth control methods than we did in the past, and that allows people to have less children. Some people are thinking that we need to sort of change the way we're thinking about our lives. If, most of us kind of think of our lives as, we're going to have about 15, 20 years of childhood, and then we're going to work for a really long time, and then we're going to have 5 or 10 years of retirement, and then we pass away. That paradigm is maybe old. Maybe it was, it belonged in a previous era, but that today there are these sort of 3 stages of life. One is our childhood, and maybe it shouldn't just be 20 or 15 to 20 years. Maybe it should be 20 to 25 years as the amount of education increases, so that today you need a bachelor's degree in order to have a middle-class job. Obviously, I'm speaking generally. You don't have to have a bachelor's degree, but many people find that without a bachelor's degree, their desire for a comfortable middle-class lifestyle is blocked. So many people are getting bachelor's degrees. And an increasing number of people are going on to get master's degrees. And these degrees take time. And so that may push people up until their mid-20s to finish their sort of education. Okay, so then after 25-ish, then you're working for about 40 years. And that's sort of the adult years. But then if people are retiring, 65 is the traditional retirement age. But people aren't going to just live until they're 75. The average person in America lives to be about 78. But if you've made it till 60 years old, let's say, then your odds are you're not going to die at 78. You're probably going to live significantly beyond that. Remember, life expectancy is from your birth. And so as you continue to survive, then the odds are you're going to continue to survive longer. And so, if you're 60 or 65 years old looking to retire, you shouldn't plan on living to be 78. You should plan on living to be 85 or even 90, depending on your health. And so if you look at those numbers, 65 to 75 is 10 years, 75 to 85 is another 10 years. So we're looking at 20, but maybe even 25 years of kind of this last stage of life, for which many of us are not prepared, at least not prepared financially. And realize that this is a change historically. Historically, first of all, childhood was short, because childhood is marked by preparing for the working world. And in the past, there wasn't as much pressure on reading and writing and being able to use computers and geometry and physics and world history and all these sort of things that are today very important. But in the past, when we were, especially in agricultural society and then later on even industrial society, People didn't need to know these things like they do today, and so childhood would have been shortened. 10 years old in the past has been, a time when somebody could have gone to work and been treated like an adult. But today, that's obviously grown much larger. Um, and the elderly years were also historically shortened. It wasn't, you didn't have the expectation of, oh, I'm going to live from the time that I'm 65 till 85 where I'm not working. No. First of all, we would have, most people would have died long before they hit 65. But even that period of, say, 20 years or even 10 years of living after you stop working is a very new concept in our society. Historically, people worked until they were unable to work. You did your profession until you were no longer physically able to do it. Your eyesight wasn't good enough, or your limbs weren't working, or you weren't able to last the day. And at that point, you would have had to rely on other people, typically your family. In medieval Europe, it was the landowner or potentially the Catholic Church that would have helped you feed yourself. But oftentimes, people would have gotten acute illnesses that last like 3 months or less, and those would have killed them fairly short, in fairly short order. Today, elderly people are living for decades with chronic illnesses. These would include especially things like diabetes and heart disease and even cancer, where people will live years and years with them, and people are receiving treatment for them, but it takes a long time for those chronic illnesses to be kind of overpower our amazing modern medical technology. So, I mentioned that people were relying on others in order for their welfare, for their shelter, for their food, for their health care. Well, today we have Social Security, which was created during the Great Depression as a way of guaranteeing people a minimal amount of income. But what that does is it allows people to live also without the help of their family. They can survive on their own. But the truth is that Social Security was never really meant to be the lion in the room in terms of people's income. It was only supposed to be a supplemental, whereas the idea is that people were supposed to save for their own retirement on their own. And in the past, companies did this by providing pensions to people. After they worked 40 years at the factory, then the company would pay for their retirement years. And so what that did is it created independence, especially from parents and their children, where elderly parents are no longer as reliant on their families for their livelihood like they had in the past. And what this has meant is that people now have the expectation of living decades beyond their working years, doing things like traveling or hanging out with grandchildren or volunteering, things like that. Other than just getting old, which many people complain about as their body begins to sort of, slow down, deteriorate, have more health issues, things like that. But again, that's more of a medical issue, not so much a sociological issue, or at least it's a biological issue. And so while those are obviously true on a personal level, that's not the focus of this class. You're probably familiar with the terms racism and sexism, prejudice, discrimination against people based upon their race or upon their sex. Well, ageism is prejudice against people due to their age. And we typically think about the elderly, not necessarily, the 5-year-olds. So ageism is characterized by stereotypes and assumptions about people because they're old. Now, racism is largely unspoken. It is not something that is socially acceptable to say things that are racist, right? And the same goes to some extent for sexism. But when it comes to ageism, people say it all the time.
Hey, I guess they're right. Senior citizens, although slow and dangerous behind the wheel, can still serve a purpose.
I'll be right back. Don't you go dying on me!
It looks like decreasing the responsibility that you think somebody should have because of their age. It looks like decreasing the amount of respect for somebody based upon their age. And then also decreasing the relationships that people have with somebody because of their age, right? So if you think about what makes life meaningful, right? So take a second, what makes life really meaningful? Well, life really becomes meaningful when you're doing activities that have meaning, that you're looking at this thing and you're saying, this is important, this is worth my time. Whether that's providing food for somebody or writing a book that you feel like is actually going to have a positive impact on somebody's life, doing some sort of job, volunteering, parenting, caring for somebody that you believe is, this is important, this is worth my time, okay? And then the other part that makes life meaningful are relationships. Sure, fame, beauty, money, all those things can kind of add to it and make life more comfortable or maybe more interesting. But meaning ultimately comes down to doing things that are meaningful and relationships that we have. All right. So when we say to an elderly person that, hey, relax, I got this, don't worry about it, I know you're elderly, hey, this is something that the younger people can handle, hey, I don't want to overwhelm you, this may be too much for you. What we're doing there is something called paternalistic prejudice. We're being nice about it, but it's still prejudice. And we do this for women as well. Hey, relax, or like, hey, I'm just here to protect you, right? Sometimes we can fall into this prejudice, but we're nice about it. That's what kind of makes it paternalistic, right? So if you think about if you're an elderly person and maybe you ran your own business and you had employees under you and you had responsibilities, and then you turn 70 years old and you retire from your job, and then you've done well for yourself, and so you move to Florida, you sell your home here where it's cold, and you move somewhere warm, and then everywhere you go, people are trying to do the heavy lifting for you, and when it comes to decision making, people aren't really listening to your ideas, despite the fact that you might have a lot of experience in the topic at hand. What you feel like is people think that I'm pathetic, that I cannot do for myself, that I can't help anybody else. Sure, they're being sort of respectful, or they're being nice. Respectful is not the right word. They're being nice about it. They're trying to make me feel good, but they're not telling me that I'm powerful. Like, nobody believes that I'm capable. I don't feel like anyone is saying, I believe that you can do whatever you want to do. And I believe that you can do great things. Everyone's expecting me to just kind of take it easy and relax. And again, the meaning of life comes from doing activities that are meaningful. And no one's expecting you or even allowing you to do those activities. The first page of our book talked about this, how this occurred in Japan after the tsunami took out one of the nuclear power plants in Japan. There were all these elderly scientists who volunteered and said, I want to help clean up this spill, this nuclear waste. I'm not going to have children. I'm elderly, and so if I get radiated, it is better that it happened to me than it would happen to somebody who's, say, in their mid-20s or mid-30s who may have, many, many decades and small children at home. But the response was, no, 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 no. We're going to let professionals, we're going to let people who are more capable of doing this handle it, you know? And so that doesn't feel like respect. That feels like people don't think that I can do anything. And then the other part is relationships. Relationships, many of our relationships come from our work. They come from our activities and doing those sorts of things. And so even when we're healthy, we may not have the relationships with the general population. If we're in Florida hanging out with other people who are retired, sure, we have those relationships, but we're not relating to people who are the professionals in the working world. Maybe before we retired, we had those relationships. But if I were to then get sick and go to a nursing home, unfortunately, those are pretty lonely places where people are isolated away from the rest of society, and people aren't visited very much by their friends and family, unfortunately. So many elderly people, for them, ageism looks like they're not doing the things that they found meaningful, and they're separated away from the things that were really important to them. By the way, we think of elderly people as being nice. Like if you ask the average person on the street, describe an elderly person, what they'll say is things like, well, they're nice, and they're cute, as they're buttering their little bread with their little shaky hands. But the overall meaning that kind of comes across is that people believe that elderly people are sort of incompetent, especially when it comes to things like technology, which is constantly evolving and changing. The general consensus is that elderly people can't do mobile technology. They can't do computers. They can't learn as fast. And so this really matters if you're an elderly person trying to get a job, where computers are now everywhere. It's no longer just, relegated to just certain industries. The computer programmers who have an office down the street, it's in education, it's in healthcare, it's almost hard to escape it. And so if an elderly person wants to work, then they may have a hard time, because the assumptions are, you're nice, you're probably reliable, but you're going to cost us a lot of money on our healthcare insurance plan, and we're not sure that you can keep up with the technological requirements of this job. So this is why we are spending $50 billion a year in America on anti-aging products. Things to color our hair, to make them black again, things to get rid of the wrinkles, things to make us feel, act, and look young, right? Because nobody wants to be associated with being nice but incompetent. And so there's a strong emphasis on people looking younger so that the assumptions about older people don't stick to them. This especially applies to women. I keep picturing the aisle of Walgreens and all the anti-aging products that they have there. And a lot of those products are marketed to women. And why is it that women are oftentimes the target of the marketing campaigns? Well, because in the United States, we judge women based upon their appearance. We tend to judge men more so on their accomplishments or their money. We tend to judge women more based upon their looks. And so for women, it's especially, I don't want to say important, but for women, there's extra pressure that they look young and beautiful for as long as they can. I don't know about you, but I hope that my retirement is filled with traveling, maybe around the world, maybe getting an RV or the van life, maybe having a little hut by the sea, leisure, volunteer, maybe writing a book or doing something creative like that. But for a lot of people, this dream, which is very common, will not be possible because of financial complications. About 10% of the elderly are poor, which actually isn't bad, because that's about the same as the general population. In fact, it's usually the elderly people have a less poverty than the general population, especially if you compare the elderly to, say, women and children. The poverty rate is significantly less. In the past, before Social Security in this country, the elderly, a significant number of them were poor because they were unable to work or had trouble finding a job, and they didn't have Social Security or retirement savings set up. By the way, Social Security checks in the United States average about $1,500 a month. So Social Security checks are based upon the amount of income that you made during your working years. So if you made a lot of money during your working years, your checks are going to be higher. If you were poor during your working years, your checks are going to be less. Social Security acts as a floor for many elderly people. So it's a great thing. It is not that much money. $1,500 a month is about $18,000 a year. And when you're elderly, your expenses, specifically transportation and healthcare, may be significantly higher than they are now. But it does provide a floor for people in that they won't receive less than whatever the minimal amount for Social Security is. And that's a great thing because many people don't have any retirement funds outside of their Social Security checks. Many that do have retirement savings don't have nearly enough to last them until they're 80, forget 90 years old. If you retire at 65 with, say, $100,000 saved for retirement, the likelihood is you will blow through that before you even hit 70, right? And the person may live to be 85. I mean, it's very difficult to guess how long you're going to live unless you have significant health problems in which you could probably assume that you won't live as long. But if you hit 65 and you are healthy and there's no historical, put a pattern of people dying, early, then you really should plan on living to be 90 or even older than that. And so $100,000 isn't nearly enough to live comfortably in retirement. From research that I've done, they suggest that people should have closer to $1 million saved for retirement. And I know that sounds like a lot of money, but I want you to think about it this way. Today, the average person's salary is, $50,000. We'll keep the math easy. So $50,000, that means every 2 years, that's $100,000, right? So if you have $1 million and you spend $50,000 a year, well, that's going to last you 20 years, so from 65 to 85. But what happens if you live longer than that, Well, hopefully you've had that money will grow if it's invested somewhere, and it will grow so that, it doesn't run out in just 20 years and that it'll last you until you're into your 90s. And maybe you'll have something to pass on to your children. Or your heirs. Many people are unprepared financially for retirement. There was some research that was done by the Consumer Finances. They did a survey, and what they found was amongst 55 to 64-year-olds, so that age group that's like right before traditional retirement age, which at this point they should have a significant amount of retirement savings. Only half of them even had retirement savings. That means half of them didn't have retirement savings. So what are they going to do during when they're 70 years old or 75 years old? Well, a couple things. If they can work, they are going to work. Okay? Now, they may not be able to work at a job that is a nice job that has benefits and a good salary. So they might be working in a retail store, smiling while customers come in, or they'll be relying solely on Social Security or their children for their welfare, right? Of the people who did have retirement savings, the median amount, which means half of them had less than this and half of them had more than this, was $134,000. And again, $134,000 is just not going to last them very long unless they're able to cut their living expenses dramatically. When this survey looked at 75-year-olds and older, so these are people who are likely in their retirement years, many of them anyway, the median amount was $83,000. So again, if people are spending $40,000, we'll reduce it to $40,000 a year, their savings aren't going to last them more than a couple of years. Now I'm not including Social Security in this, but Social Security isn't giving them that much. It's giving them $18,000. So, and again, in my mind, when I think about my retirement years, I think, okay, I'd like to have a little bit less income than I have now. Like that would be my goal. But I may not be able to get away with that because medical expenses may eat up a lot more of my income than they do today. I can tell you today I spend very little on going to the doctor or having procedures. When I'm 75 or 85, I might be going to the doctor and having medical procedures a lot more so. Women tend to be impacted by poverty in their elderly years at higher rates than men do. Couple of reasons for this. One is that during women's working careers, they made less money because historically and even today, women make less money than men do. And so if people say save 10% of their salary for retirement, and if you're a high income earning man, then you're going to have more money set aside for retirement. And if you're a low income earning woman, then you're going to have less money set aside for retirement. To add insult to injury, women tend to outlive men by at least a couple of years on average. And so they're going to have an increased opportunity to burn through the retirement savings that they have. Even if, say, the woman is a widow and her husband had a retirement account that they both shared, but he dies at 80 and she's still alive at 85, well, she's had 5 extra years in which to potentially spend down their retirement amount. So it's an interesting problem to try to solve. How do you increase the income of elderly people, given that people are living so much longer than they used to? So one of the things is that people are encouraged to continue working into their late 60s, early 70s. I might say work as long as you're physically able and as long as it's still enjoyable to you. Many people retire only to discover that they made a mistake. I mean, even ideally, they're sitting on the beach, drink in hand and thinking about, boy, I wonder what's going on at the office. I wonder if Jerry in accounting, is still showing up late. They miss that activity, goal-oriented activity for this. One solution is to increase Social Security payments. But the opposite is actually happening as we have more and more people who are taking from Social Security, not taking like robbing because they paid into it, but when Social Security was set up back 100 years ago or so, most people would never even receive Social Security checks because they never lived long enough to receive them. Average life expectancy back when this was started was in the upper 50s, and people didn't get their first check until they were 65. And so the fund did fine because most people never got a chance to touch Social Security. But today, most people are going to receive a Social Security check at some point. And so the fund is running out of money. And so what they're doing is they're now not allowing people to receive the full amount until they're older. And so that obviously is okay for people who are healthy and especially people who have money, but it hurts the poor. So
All right, well, we've had some technical difficulties here on my end, so that is why I am now recording this last part in my office. And so picking up where we left off last time was talking about income and about the difficulties that elderly people have with income. Moving on to health, being older is one of the more vulnerable times of one's life, especially when it comes to health. Health. It's the time when people often report that their bodies begin to break down. They visit the doctor more often. They have more thoughts and concerns about their own health. In the past, we were affected a lot more by acute illnesses. Many of us died of acute illnesses, things like pneumonia and viruses and things like that. But today, people are living and dying, even though the dying process may take decades, of chronic illnesses, things like diabetes, heart disease. Elderly people are large users of the healthcare system. The elderly only make up around 10 to 15% of the population, but they occupy 35% of all the healthcare dollars that are spent. In total, the United States spends $3.2 trillion on healthcare in any given year. So 35% of that is around $1 trillion that is spent on elderly healthcare every year. I'm not saying that's bad. I think that's a good thing in the sense that we want to take care of the elderly people, but it is extremely expensive for us to do so. And I think that there are actually solutions to that that don't include having elderly people not go without health care. We need to work on reducing the cost of health care, and we'll actually talk specifically about that in one of the later chapters. We have a system in the United States known as Medicare. If you get mixed up between Medicare and Medicaid, I think of it as Medicare is for people who are older who may need more care, and people who are poor, which is what Medicaid is directed toward primarily, they need aid. They don't necessarily need care, they need aid. But Medicare is set up for people who are 65 and older, and it covers some of the basics of health. And that you can then add more parts to it. Like there's part A, there's part B, there's part C, and everybody gets the basic part, but then people can add other parts to it, such as like medications and other benefits, but those cost more money for people. But overall, Medicare is a very popular program. It's also a very expensive program, but it's, again, kind of a safety net for the elderly that keeps them from falling into major into a situation where they don't have any medical care at all. The same way that Social Security provides a safety net for elderly people so that they don't have no money coming in. And one of the things to realize is that your working life really has a strong impact on how the rest of your life goes. Like a good job can really change your life for the better. A really bad job can change your life for the worst. If you think about what a good job brings a healthy environment, meaningful work, people that you want to see and work with. It also brings income, which allows you to take care of yourself. Oftentimes, Good jobs come with benefits like health care and retirement and insurance. Um, and so it's really a big deal being able to access, being able to at least aim for and have a decent shot at having a good job. But ageism affects this area of life probably more so than other places. You know, if you go to the grocery store and the person who is checking out your groceries, um, displays ageism toward you and is like, "What are you doing buying this stuff when you're so old?" Um, it's annoying, it's disrespectful. It's not going to like really change your life that much. If you get fired from your job because you're 70 years old, that's really going to change your life in a dramatic way. As a society, we think of elderly people as kind of a mixed bag of good and bad qualities. They are seen as reliable, especially compared to, say, the youngest people in the workforce. They're seen as having positive work habits, but they're also seen as being inflexible. They don't want to try new things. They don't want to do things new way. They're also seen as being less productive and less able to embrace new technology, and also expensive, especially when it comes to healthcare insurance. So the positives and the negatives fall to the disadvantage of the elderly people, where there's more bad things for elderly in the minds of many people who are in administration. And so that's why a lot of elderly people struggle to find good work, to um, get promoted, to get a better job. And as we discussed in the last section, a lot of elderly people don't have enough money set aside for retirement, and so for them, they have to work, but they are unable to get a job that maybe would lift them out of the situation that they're in, or that would allow them to retire even when they are 80 years old. And so those people are basically planning on working until they are physically unable or until they die. So they're not hired for the job that they want to get because of their age. And if you think about that, how frustrating that would be. You work really hard, you train, you're respectful to people, you have the qualifications, you have the education, and yet you can't get the job because of something that is completely out of your control. So that is my talk over chapter 6. We talked about health care and the health of elderly people. We've talked about people at work. We've talked about the financial situation that many elderly people find themselves in, including poverty, and how more women are impacted by that. We've talked about paternalistic prejudice, the "oh, you're so cute and nice, but kind of go sit in the corner" kind of a mentality that a lot of people have. We talked about ageism. We've talked about how historically elderly people were not in as great a number as they are today. How there are an increasing percentage of elderly people due to things like the fact that we're living longer and the fact that we're having less children, and that the United States and around the world is graying in the sense that we're, on average, the population of Earth is much older than it used to be. So that is my talk over chapter 6.